First story. Hey Reddit, I'm Alex. This happened a couple of years ago, but I still think about it from time to time, and I feel like it's worth sharing. It was a typical Friday evening, and my friend Greg and I had just finished a long week of work. We decided to blow off some steam and go to a nearby bar we hadn't been to in a while. It wasn't one of those fancy places, it was more of a dive bar, the kind where the drinks are cheap, the lights are dim, and the music's always a bit too loud, but it's got character. The night started out normal, laughing over stupid jokes, talking about life, and just unwinding. Around midnight, the bar started to get more crowded, and we both agreed it was time to head home. Greg doesn't live too far from me, so we usually walk back together. We stepped outside into the cold, damp air, our breath fogging up in front of us. The streets were pretty quiet, which was typical for this part of town. I remember Greg making a comment about how it felt eerily quiet, but I brushed it off. We'd done this walk dozens of times, and nothing ever happened. Plus, we weren't exactly in a bad neighborhood. As we made our way down one of the quieter streets, something caught my attention. It was a stray dog, limping and sniffing around the trash cans near the sidewalk. It looked scruffy, like it hadn't had a good meal in days. Greg noticed it too, and I could see the compassion in his eyes. Greg's always been an animal lover, especially when it comes to dogs. Without hesitating, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out some leftover beef jerky from earlier in the night, and crouched down to offer it to the dog. The dog hesitated at first, wary of us, but hunger got the best of it. It limped closer and cautiously took the jerky from Greg's hand. We watched as it devoured the food like it hadn't eaten in days. Greg started talking to it softly, like it was an old friend. I chuckled, not really thinking much of it. I mean, it was just a dog, right? But then something strange happened. The dog stopped eating, its ears perked up, and it started growling, low and menacing. Its eyes were fixed on something behind us. I turned around, confused, and that's when I saw them. Two guys were walking down the street, a little too quickly, and they didn't look friendly. I'd seen that kind of body language before, shoulders hunched, hands stuffed in their pockets, eyes darting around. Something was off. Greg must have sensed it too because he straightened up, his face tense. "Let's keep moving," Greg whispered, but before we could even take a step, one of the guys called out to us. "Hey, you got a light?" the taller one asked, his voice slurred but sharp. I could tell he wasn't just looking for a smoke. "We don't smoke," I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. The shorter guy smirked, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. They were slowly closing the gap between us, and my instincts were screaming at me that this wasn't going to end well. Suddenly, the dog, this stray, scrapper-looking dog, stepped in front of us, baring its teeth. It let out a deep, threatening bark that echoed through the empty street. The taller guy paused, eyeing the dog with obvious discomfort. "Chill out, man, it's just a dog," the shorter one muttered, but he didn't sound so sure anymore. Greg and I didn't move, unsure of what to do next. The dog didn't back down, though. It stood its ground, growling and barking, its eyes locked onto the two guys. For a moment, it felt like time froze. The two men hesitated, and I saw a flicker of doubt cross their faces. Then, almost as quickly as they'd appeared, they decided we weren't worth the trouble. The taller one muttered something under his breath, and they turned around, disappearing into the shadows of the next street. Greg and I stood there, stunned. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could tell Greg was shaken too. The dog turned to look at us, its demeanor instantly softening. It wagged its tail slightly and limped back over to Greg, nudging his hand with its nose. Greg knelt down again, petting the dog's head. "Good dog," he whispered, his voice a little shaky. We didn't stick around much longer after that. We made our way back to Greg's apartment, with the stray following us for most of the walk. It eventually wandered off into the night, but not before Greg gave it the rest of the jerky and a few more pats on the head. We never saw the dog again, but Greg likes to joke that it was some sort of guardian angel in disguise. Me? I don't know what to believe, but I do know one thing: if that dog hadn't been there, things could have gone very differently that night. We've walked that street a few times since, but I always feel a little more on edge, like I'm waiting for something to happen again. But now, every time I see a stray dog, I think back to that night and wonder just how much that dog understood, more than we did, that's for sure. So, yeah, that's the story of how a stray dog saved us from what could have been a pretty bad situation. Sometimes, you never know who, or what, is going to have your back when you need it the most. Second story. Hey Reddit, I'm Jenna. I want to share with you one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. It was back in my early 20s, a few years ago, and it started as an innocent weekend road trip with some friends. We didn't plan for anything out of the ordinary, but it turned into one of those stories that you can't forget no matter how much time passes. So, here's the setup: my best friend Talia, her boyfriend Jake, and I decided to take a spontaneous road trip. The idea was simple: drive upstate for the weekend, explore some small towns, and enjoy the kind of carefree days that only happen in your 20s. We had no specific destination in mind, just a tank full of gas and a general direction. We started out early Saturday morning, coffee in hand and music blasting in Jake's old beat-up sedan. The sun was shining, and we were all excited to escape the city for a couple of days. We drove for hours, stopping at random diners, roadside attractions, and little antique shops. The day was going perfectly until we got lost. It was late afternoon, and we were somewhere deep in the countryside. Our GPS lost signal, and none of us had decent cell service to get our bearings. But instead of panicking, we laughed it off. Jake, who was behind the wheel, said we should just keep driving until we hit a main road. So that's what we did. After about an hour of winding through back roads, we realized we hadn't seen another car or house for a while. The scenery had shifted from quaint farms to overgrown fields and dense woods. It was kind of eerie, but we still weren't too worried. We figured we'd eventually find a town, or at least a gas station. Then, as the sun started to set, we came across something unexpected. On the side of the road, hidden behind a wall of trees, was what looked like an old, abandoned house. It wasn't just any house, though; it was huge. A mansion, almost. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. The driveway was long and covered in weeds, and the windows were boarded up. There was a rusty old gate at the entrance, hanging on by a single hinge. "Whoa, this place is creepy," Talia said from the back seat, leaning forward to get a better look. Jake slowed the car down as we drove past, all of us staring at the house in silence. There was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. "We should check it out," Jake said, grinning like he was daring us. I laughed nervously, but Talia was on board immediately. "Let's do it." "When else are we going to have a chance to explore a creepy old mansion?" I wasn't so sure. Something about the place gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't want to be the killjoy. So, after a little more convincing, I agreed. Jake parked the car just off the road, and we climbed out, walking toward the rusty gate. As we made our way up the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The house loomed over us, its dark silhouette even more menacing up close. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. Jake, of course, was the first to step inside, with Talia close behind him. I lingered at the door for a moment, feeling my stomach twist. Something just didn't feel right, but I ignored it and followed them in. The inside of the house was just as creepy as the outside. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The furniture was old, draped in dirty white sheets, and there were cobwebs everywhere. The wooden floor creaked under our feet as we moved through the rooms. Talia was taking pictures on her phone, laughing and joking about how we should turn this into a haunted house tour business. Jake was poking around, trying to find a way upstairs. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. It was like the house itself was telling us to leave. That's when we heard it, a noise from upstairs. It was faint, like something scraping against the floor. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake, always the brave one, nodded and immediately started toward the stairs. "Probably just an animal," he said casually, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Talia followed him, but I stayed where I was, my heart racing. I was about to tell them we should leave when the noise came again, louder this time. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like something, or someone, moving. "Guys, maybe we should go," I said, my voice shaking. But Jake was already halfway up the stairs, determined to see what was making the noise. Talia was right behind him, giggling nervously. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, torn between my fear and my curiosity. Before I could decide whether to follow them or bolt, Jake called out from upstairs. Guys? You might want to see this." Reluctantly, I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding. When I reached the top, I found Jake and Talia standing in the hallway, staring at a closed door at the far end. The door was shaking, like something on the other side was trying to get out. "What the hell?" I muttered. Jake, of course, decided to open the door. The second he touched the doorknob, the shaking stopped. The door creaked open slowly, and we all peered inside. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center, facing the window. There was something unsettling about it, like it had been placed there deliberately. But what really freaked us out was the fact that the chair was rocking back and forth on its own. We didn't wait to find out why. Jake, Talia, and I bolted out of that house faster than I've ever run in my life. We didn't stop until we were back in the car, doors locked, engine running. We didn't say much on the drive back to civilization. The whole thing was just too weird. None of us could explain what had happened, and we weren't eager to talk about it. To this day, I have no idea what we experienced in that house. Maybe it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. Maybe it was something else. All I know is, we never went back, and I don't think we ever will. So, yeah. That's my story of the time a random road trip led me to the creepiest, most unsettling place I've ever been. I still get chills thinking about it. Third story. Hey Reddit, I'm Evan. I work at a gas station. It's not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills, and I get to meet all sorts of people, mostly locals, but every once in a while, you get the odd stranger passing through. The night shifts are usually quiet, especially on weekdays, but one night last year changed my perspective on what quiet really means. Let me set the scene for you. It was a Thursday night, early November, and the weather was starting to turn cold. I was about halfway through my shift, and it was one of those painfully slow nights where you've got nothing to do but restock shelves and scroll through your phone. The station I work at is out on the edge of town, kind of isolated, with just a few scattered houses and fields nearby. The place closes at midnight, but on that particular night, around 11:15, a guy walked in. He looked normal enough, maybe mid-30s, wearing a faded hoodie and jeans. At first, I didn't think much of it. People come in late all the time, usually just to grab snacks or cigarettes before heading home. He wandered around the store for a bit, picking up a couple of small things, a bag of chips, some gum. But something about the way he moved set off alarm bells in my head. He was looking around a little too much, like he was more interested in the layout of the place than what he was buying. When he finally came up to the counter, he dropped his items down, and I started ringing him up. Then, without a word, he pulled a gun from his hoodie pocket and placed it on the counter, right next to the bag of chips. Now, I've always heard people talk about what they would do in a situation like this, but when you're actually staring down the barrel of a gun, it's a whole different story. Time seemed to slow down, and my brain went into overdrive trying to figure out what to do. My first instinct was to look up at the security cameras, but I quickly realized that wasn't going to help me right then and there. The guy didn't say anything for what felt like forever, just stared at me with this blank expression. Then, finally, he spoke. "Open the register." His voice was low, calm, like he'd done this 100 times before. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to open the register without making any sudden movements. All I could think about was how easy it would be for him to pull the trigger if I screwed up. When the register finally popped open, I stepped back, trying to give him space. He reached over and started pulling out the cash, slowly, methodically, like he had all the time in the world. There wasn't much in there, maybe a couple $100, but he didn't seem to care. As he was stuffing the money into his pocket, I noticed something strange. He wasn't wearing gloves, which seemed like a stupid oversight for someone robbing a store. My mind started racing, trying to figure out if I should do something, anything, to stop him. That's when I heard the door chime. I glanced over, and to my complete surprise, one of our regulars had walked in, a guy named Tony who lives a couple of blocks away. He's one of those friendly, chatty types who always comes in late to buy beer or snacks and talks your ear off about whatever game's on that night. Tony was completely oblivious to what was happening. He didn't even notice the gun, just strolled up to the fridge like it was any other night. The robber glanced at him but didn't say a word. Tony grabbed a six-pack of beer and started walking toward the counter, still not realizing what was going on. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but I knew it wasn't good. When Tony reached the counter, he finally noticed the gun. His eyes went wide, and for a second, he froze. The robber didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared at Tony like he was waiting to see what he'd do. In that split second, Tony did the dumbest thing I've ever seen anyone do. He tried to act cool. I guess he thought if he didn't make a big deal out of it, the situation would somehow resolve itself. He put the six-pack on the counter and said, "Are you guys still open?" The robber gave him this look, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, without a word, he grabbed the beer, tucked it under his arm, and walked out the door with the cash and the beer like he was just doing some late-night shopping. I stood there in stunned silence for a few seconds, not fully processing what had just happened. Tony, on the other hand, started laughing nervously, like he couldn't believe what he'd just seen either. "Dude, what the hell just happened?" he asked, still chuckling like it was some kind of joke. I didn't answer him right away. My hands were still shaking, and all I could think about was how close we'd come to something much worse happening. I told Tony to sit tight while I called the cops, which he did, still muttering about how crazy the whole thing was. When the police finally showed up, I gave them a description of the guy, told them about the gun, the cash, the beer, everything. They took our statements and reviewed the security footage, but honestly, I didn't have much hope they'd catch the guy. He hadn't done anything particularly memorable, just another face in a hoodie, blending into the night. The next morning, I had to explain what happened to my boss, which was almost worse than the robbery itself. She was pissed, but not at me, at the fact that we'd lost money. I told her I did everything I could, and thankfully, she understood that there wasn't much I could have done differently. In the end, the guy never got caught. The police told me it was probably some out-of-towner passing through, looking for a quick score. They said it happens more than people realize in rural areas like ours. I was shaken up for a few days, but eventually, I went back to work like nothing had happened. Tony still comes in every now and then, and he loves to bring up that night, usually after a couple of beers. He calls himself the coolest guy to ever walk into a robbery. I just shake my head and laugh, even though deep down, I know how lucky we were that things didn't go south. So, that's the story of the time I almost got robbed at gunpoint, and how Tony, of all people, somehow managed to walk out with beer instead of a bullet. Stay safe out there, Reddit. You never know what kind of weirdness might be waiting for you at your next shift.